You are listening to the Thoughts from a Page podcast, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name is Cindy Burnett, and I love to talk about books with anyone and everyone. While listening to my podcast, you will hear author interviews, behind-the-scenes conversations about various aspects of the publishing world, theme discussions with other book lovers, and more. For more book recommendations and a complete list of all of my interviews, check out my website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that I'm going to be taking a break starting August 5th through Friday, August 26th, when I will return with an interview with Chris Kander, author of A Gracious Neighbor. This is a great time to get caught up on any past episodes that you haven't had time to listen to yet. And if there's one that you particularly enjoy, please share it on social media. It really helps me find new listeners when that happens, so thank you in advance. In addition, if you're caught up on all of my episodes, I would love for you to join my Patreon group if you're looking for more fun book conversations. I have all sorts of bonus episodes there, plus a newsletter and a Facebook group. I'd love to have you. Today, Leigh Newman joins me to chat about Nobody Gets Out Alive. Leigh is also the author of Still Points North, a memoir about growing up in Alaska. Her memoir was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize. Her stories have appeared in Harper's, The Paris Review, Tin House, McSweeney's Quarterly Concern, One Story, and Electric Literature. In 2020, she was awarded the Paris Review's Terry Southern Prize, a Best American Short Story, a Pushcart Prize, and an American Society of Magazine Editors Fiction Prize for her work in the Paris Review. Previously, she co-founded the indie press Black Balloon Catapult, where she still works as editor-at-large. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Leigh. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so glad you're here, and I really, really enjoyed your collection of short stories called Nobody Gets Out Alive, and all of the wonderful press you've had, star reviews from Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and Booklist, and this wonderful New York Times review. Are you just thrilled to pieces?
Yes, honestly, I'm kind of stunned. You know, you want these things in your, like in the dark of night, you'll say, oh my God, wouldn't that be great? Not even just to start Kirkus review, like just to get a Kirkus review that was good because they can be so tricky.
Exactly.
Like, I don't even think I would have had the temerity to put a star on that. I probably was like, dear God, please let it be like not bad. That's probably how I'd have phrased it in my mind. And same thing, just to get into the New York Times to me on the level that I'm on, like makes you feel so, it just turns your day to champagne because all those years of work, right? And so many little wrong turns could happen. And so when they somehow all turn right, you feel so, I just feel really lucky. Honestly, I just feel super, super lucky.
Well, it's all very exciting and very well deserved.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we start out with you talking a little bit about Nobody Gets Out Alive? Give me a quick synopsis for those that won't have read it yet.
Okay, so Nobody Gets Out Alive is a collection of stories, short stories about Alaska where I grew up, and they are linked. What I did was invent a lake called Diamond Lake, which is very similar to lots of lakes that are in Anchorage, Alaska, where people kind of live in a normal suburban environment, but in their backyard they have an airplane or maybe two, or they have a helicopter, maybe some snow machines, and they kind of go in and out of the wilderness with these vehicles. And why I wanted to create the lake was to have different families interacting. So you would see a little girl's story, and then maybe you would see her later when she was 50 and a neighbor of someone. One of the stories is the origin story of the lake and of the formation of Anchorage, Alaska. But they would add kind of these contexts because people are sleeping together, or they're having affairs, or they're getting married, or they're best friends over time, or they go to each other's parties and are mentioning it in passing. And I wanted it to like give the feeling of a small town, which very much, even Anchorage, Alaska, which is the biggest city in Alaska, is hardly even really a city. I think it's a town still, or at its heart it is. On the other hand, I also wanted to show what real Alaskans live like, because I've seen so many reality shows that have almost no bearing on the diversity of Alaska, the culture of Alaskans. They live in town, they go to Costco and they have a strip mall and they go bowling, right? But then they like go on their summers or on their weekends and they're regularly going out to the wilderness to like hunt caribou for food or fish for salmon or climb mountains or build a remote cabin. Like those two sides are definitely, part and parcel of what it's like to be an Alaskan. And I really wasn't seeing that sort of portrayed when I would see television shows where they had sort of people living under a tarp, or like a lot of people would ask me if I'd seen the show called Alone, which I guess is like people going into the wilderness alone naked. And I was like, no Alaskan would ever do that. Like,
It's way too cold.
yeah, we're in it to survive. We're not in it, like our idea would be going with really good gear, you know what I mean? And be protected from the elements.
Well, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but one of my favorite vacations my family has taken is a cruise to Alaska. And then we took the train on up to Denali and a bus back. And I just loved it. It was absolutely beautiful. But I know my perspective as a guest and as a vacationer is vastly different than the experience of living in Alaska. So I really enjoyed your book to kind of fill in some of the pieces for me.
Can I ask a question? Did you guys stop in Skagway?
I think so. We did. We stopped 4 places, and I'm trying to think. Obviously, we started right out of Anchorage, and then we headed down to Vancouver, and we stopped 3 or 4 ports. I think so, and I think we might have ziplined there. Do you know if that's?
Yeah, it's a huge thing to stop in Skagway, which is actually, so a lot of my book was written physically in Skagway because my friends have a cabin there where I go in the summer to finish my stories. But that part of Alaska, that area of Alaska that is called Southeast, that is like the most beautiful. It's also what I call like NPR Alaska. It's close as we have to Seattle, and it's cultural. There's a lot of theater, even in these little tiny towns. Like there's bookstores and theater. And I kind of grew up in Anchorage and then in the interior, which is like a little bit, we grew up off grid, it's a different culture. It's a huge state. And when I tell people that I'm going home for Alaska and they're like, oh, you're going for a week? And I'm like, for me to go to like Skagway takes like a 12-hour flight, then I have to spend the night, and then I have a 6-hour ferry, and then I have to drive over a mountain, and then I'm at a cabin. So I would never go for less than 2 weeks just to even see my family. Like at one point my brother was in Fairbanks and my dad was in Anchorage and my friends were in Skagway. Other friends are in Juneau, and, those all take big commercial flights and stuff to get to.
I just thought it was absolutely stunning. Like there was just so many really cool things to see. But what you're talking about in terms of things being far apart, the train from Anchorage out to Denali, which puts you outside Denali, so you're not even in the park. And then we took this, I think it was like a 10-hour tour of Denali, which goes in like 5 hours and back out 5 hours. And you still don't even get very close to the mountain, the Denali, the peak there. And so it's just amazing how big it is. But of course, I live in Texas and it's not as big as Alaska, but it's pretty darn big. And people don't always understand the same thing. Like it takes me, 4 hours to drive to Dallas, and, you're in New York and you drive 4 hours and you've gone through like 3 states.
Totally. And I will say, like when I was a kid back in the 70s, my parents and I used to drive up to Denali. And at that time, they didn't make you be in a bus. We would drive up in our VW van, which we kind of lived in for a while. And we would see, I remember as a kid, first of all, being petrified at the sheer drop off the side of the road. Like I still get kind of tense on drives with cliffs because I would be looking over and it was like a dirt road up Denali. And then actually there was this little point where it said like, don't cross. And my dad would always take the chain down and we would cross and drive on more. But we saw like amazing wild sheep and wild goats. And I was just in Alaska for 2 weeks, and it's a great time if you want to see bears in June. And I saw like I was in Skagway and I saw like a cinnamon bear club, 2 black bears, like eagles are everywhere. went on a walk with a friend. This happens all the time in Anchorage, and like we ran into a big moose. Actually, the moose are kind of dangerous. I'm more afraid of running into a moose than I am of a bear. You want to be careful.
You do. We actually had two that were running through the hotel that we were staying in outside of Denali.
What?
And they were kind of running in and around. But we go to Colorado every summer and we always see the moose there too. And no, you've got to really stay away from them. They're really cool to see, but you can't get very close.
Well, the problem is that in our neighborhood in Anchorage, and that's sort of what I've loosely based the book on, we had this one spot that the moose loved to poop in, and it's right outside my bedroom window. And I can see the little pile of turds every single time. But one time, actually, a moose came, just kind of staggered out of the road and just collapsed in that spot. I was in the dining room by myself. My parents were out of town. It was about 5 years ago. And I guess the moose had been hit by a car.
Oh.
Because he lay down. I've never seen that before. And he lay down, he rested there for 4 days.
Wow.
And I was worried if he was going to pass away. I didn't know what to do. There are services that will come and help you take care of a 2-ton moose. You know, like I do know how to field dress like a caribou, but I don't know that's a big job. And also, like, how would I lift it? It's just a big job. But anyway, so I was thinking, oh God, A, I feel terrible watching this moose suffer. B, what do I do if this giant animal dies in my backyard? My parents aren't here. Oh, and also C, I was like, don't go in the backyard. And I had the dogs because I didn't want him to wake up and charge me. So I kind of just kept exiting very quietly through the front door, very careful of the noise I made and checking to make sure where he was. And then eventually after 4 days, he got up and shook it off and walked away. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. It was wonderful.
That is crazy. That is crazy and wonderful. But I think that's one of those things that as a resident of Alaska, you learn to respect those animals. And it's like every single summer in Yellowstone, they have some problem with people approaching the bison or the elk. And that woman was just gored by a bison. And you're like, how many times do people have to be told these huge 2-ton animals are not going to be like, wow, thanks for coming up and petting me, you know?
They are not your friend. And that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, Alaska features prominently as a character in your stories. And I see why as I listen to you talking about it, because obviously it was where you grew up and is a part of you.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I specifically also I wanted to talk. I mean, the reason why I also wrote the book was to show like how real Alaskans look, you know, how they negotiate the wilderness, suburbia, and urban issues. So like, I wanted to talk about things like the opioid crisis. I wanted to talk things about like alcoholism and domestic abuse. There's a lot of domestic abuse and a lot of fear of sexual assault. A lot of it is also about, the condition of women up there. I mean, of all the 8 stories, they're all women narrators except for 2. And even with that, the male narrators are looking at women. Because one of the things I most wanted to talk about was like what it's like to grow up in the wilderness when it's like, sometimes it's 80% male and you're 20%. Sometimes it's 90 and you're 1%, you're 99 and you're 1% female. You have to look at the numbers and it depends where you are in the state, right? But in a lot of times and a lot of places in Alaska, it's a lot of men and a little women and how women have adapted to that in both their strengths, like how incredible these women are, how fierce they are, how competent they are, and that they can do things like climb a glacier and like take care of a bear gun in case, to take care of their kids, take a machete and hack out a bunch of alders to get a plane that's, crash landed. And at the same time, like show up for the bake sale with a lot of cookies, work a second job as a waitress. I kind of wanted to show how these women gathered their strength from the setting and the all male, like the very male dominated world that they live in and, how it helped them and how it also like, how it really caused them to struggle in certain ways and how they had to face those struggles.
How isolating it is.
Yeah.
That was the thing that I came away from with the focus on isolation and loneliness. And as you mentioned, alcoholism, like self-medicating, that they definitely were strong, but that there is a lot that results as a result of being in the minority so much and kind of being left to your own devices and maybe the fear of the things you were describing earlier.
I think also what happens is and I think this is universal with women. I think I'm pointing it out in the Alaskan sort of version, but I've seen it kind of all over. And people will say, oh, but you're so strong, you're so independent. But underneath that is a lot of, just like any other human, right? Like somehow I think women get almost sometimes fetishized in their independence and strength. And we forget underneath that is like, there was a lot of frosting, a lot put onto that strong image because you are strong. But that doesn't mean that you don't come home at weekend, you don't crumble and be afraid of being alone or be afraid of what's going on in your life around you, even if you're seemingly fearlessly tackling it.
Absolutely, because it has to come out somewhere.
It does. It does. And usually it's when you're alone and nobody can see.
No, absolutely. Do you have a favorite of the stories?
I think my favorite is Hal Palace, which is it's the first story of the collection, and it deals with this a lot, where it's a story about a woman named Dutch who is 67 years old, and she lives on the lake in Alaska, and she's married 5 times. She's been married 5 times, and they were all disasters. Like one guy was an alcoholic, and another guy was kind of a domestic abuser, and another guy, didn't love her, and another guy was just boring. And she had kind of a boyfriend that she wanted to marry who never loved her named Carl. And she's having to sell her house because she's run out of money. And the day that she decides to sell her house, her old boyfriend Carl shows up, and she's hoping that he's going to say, "Okay, let's sell the house and go like live in the woods together in my van." And instead he's like, "Here's this dog. I need you to take care of it for me." It turns out he has cancer. That's why he wants to take care of the dog. But
And Houston's referenced in the story. I was happy to see Houston there. I was like, yay.
yeah, you know what? I asked my dad, not my dad, my brother's a doctor too. I said, "Well, where would you go get cancer?" And he said, "Oh, Houston, that's where I'd go." That's what he said.
Yeah, MD Anderson.
It's Houston for the win. It's also because I was making him have a cover of what he was lying about having cancer. And so I wanted to say he was going fishing in Galveston, which I always hear about guys doing, and wearing his fly fishing shirt. So I thought that would be a good cover. But those are far apart, but not an Alaskan mindset. Anyway, so this dog just goes all around her yard and ravages everything, and she ends up trying to trap the dog, and high hilarity results. What I want the stories to be is like you're laughing and you're laughing and you're laughing and you're laughing because it's so outrageous and funny and out of control, and then all of a sudden, boom, it kind of stabs you in the heart, and you realize it's so much more serious and meaningful than you thought. And that story, I feel like that goal was achieved. I don't even think I had that goal when I was writing it, but when I was able to finish the end, I felt like, oh, that is the mix I want. Like so much of humor can get so light, like it ends up being like a sitcom. You have to be so careful with it. How do we get like the full range of emotions into a story where you want to laugh all the time, and then you want to think about the ideas, and then you kind of want to cry or feel so deeply with the characters? How do you get all three of those things going at the same time?
And those are the kind of stories that stay with you that you continue to think about long after you're done with them.
Yeah, and I was thinking about a lot of short story writers as I wrote this book. There's just really not very many. There's wonderful writers out of Alaska, but there hasn't been the same like tradition and legacy as there has been in other parts of the country. And I was looking at like a lot of Southern writers because I was sort of wanted to develop an Alaskan voice in the same way. And there's so many rich storytellers that have come out of the South and use language in a kind of like lavish, over the top way, but created so much emotion out of it. And I was sort of thinking, how could I do that for Alaska? How could I take Flannery O'Connor and put her, make an Alaskan Flannery O'Connor, or like I actually was looking at Faulkner, not so much because I'm not crazy about his short stories, but his just boldness, or Cormac McCarthy in his early novels like Suttree. Like, how do you bring that crazy regionalism, to a region that doesn't have a crazy regional voice yet? In fact, most of the Alaskan writers I know are writing in a very straightforward, sincere way, but how do you make like a different kind of voice come out of this culture? So it was a lot of fun, honestly. Is that awful to say?
No, I love that.
You're reading all these people, and then you're trying to cook up something different, and you get to go to the page and write all these great stories. And, I wanted there to be like, okay, it's something I call domestic survival. And what I'm trying to say is that like it's the same dynamics that you'd have in a suburb of LA, right? The wife is cheating on the husband's distraught. But instead of them like having their showdown in their bungalow, at a kid's birthday party, my showdown is the husband takes them on a 13-mile cross-country ski across a frozen lake with 2 kids, and he's feeding them candy to keep them going. And I think it adds a kind of high-low feeling to me that it's kind of delightful. Like you think when you go to the wilderness, you're going to be fighting over like who gets to eat the ham, or like, who gets to fight off the bear. But you're really fighting about the same things or struggling with the same things that you would if you were home back in Yuck, Oregon. Oh my God, he took my pants, my last pair of good pants, or she stole my socks. Why is she so selfish? Why can't we talk to each other? And I find that kind of lovable and intriguing.
But I think you're exactly right. Having all of that happen in a landscape like Alaska is going to have different layers than it is if you're going to be in your home in LA.
You know who's really fun at doing that is, I just read him, is Gary Shteyngart. I just read Our Country Friends, and he knows how to do that too.
I've heard that. I have that book, but I still have not read it yet, and I really need to. I got it last fall. Whenever I travel, I love to pop into indie bookstores. And so I popped into the one in Newport, and I got it at the time, but I still haven't read it, but I really need to.
What I love about he's doing is, like, you would think I'd have nothing in common with this writer because he's writing like Russian, like about the Russian culture and the pandemic in New York. But actually, I feel there's so much in common. I feel like he creates like a Russian American voice in the way that I'm trying to create an Alaskan American voice with like full authority. I never had to research anything. I was always like, oh, should I talk up? There's all this technical language about the state, about the weather, about global warming, about different native communities, about different landscape features. And I was trying to bring all that in because I'd been saving up all this knowledge for years with nowhere to put it, but not put it in a way that felt like a sermon, that felt like it was germane to the stories.
Well, and even land protection, because you mentioned that about the National Park Service and,
Oh my God, yeah.
some people feeling like that the whole state's getting taken over by the federal government trying to preserve the land.
Oh, that's a regular conversation I have.
I'm sure it is.
Every village I go to that, like, the Park Service has kind of moved in, there'll be a bunch of people that will talk to, or no, they're actually even in Anchorage and even in, people, even in Skagway, which is like the whole, like, very liberal kind of hippie people would be like, well, the Park Service just won't let it alone. And they keep building these trails and bringing these people. And I'm like, they're not wrong, right? It's true. The Park Service can really, like, take over an area. And then the Park Service can be wonderful because it can bring all these people and preserve things that other people might have just cut down, right? They just might have knocked over that old hotel and put like a I don't know what, a condo or a house or something. There's so many sides to these stories, but I think maybe all writers feel this way, but me in particular, like, feel that there's all these different perspectives. Like when you talk about oil and how much, income it's brought to the state in the heydays of the pipeline. And then you see the other side, where they're going to open up pristine areas. And, what do we do when there was the oil? I was around for the Exxon oil spill and I saw all that oil gush out and that oil is still there. It's such a complicated issue that I feel like I feel all sides of it. And I feel maybe that I'm dumb that I haven't come to some point that I can say to people about what I feel about it. Like, I don't have an opinion. Sometimes I feel that way about, I don't want to get too dark, but like capital punishment. Like, I can't make up my mind. No one in my family was ever murdered, so I don't know how I would feel if someone had murdered my child or something. Like, I get very, very confused about it. But I do know the job as a writer, what I want to do is ask questions about these things and look at the different sides and show all the people that are talking about it. So it's the opposite sort of what's happening now in our culture, where we're expected to take a side and just
Right.
crap on the other person.
Right.
And I didn't grow up like that. Alaska always had all kinds of different people kind of living in harmony, even though our political beliefs could be totally different. You know what I mean? I'm not living in harmony, arguing, okay, but being friends, right?
Not living with the horribleness today where if you feel like you're on the opposite side of a spectrum, you shouldn't even be friends, which is so crazy.
Yeah, or you shouldn't go to dinner together. You know what I mean? Like, I feel so privileged to have grown up with lots of Republicans and lots of Democrats, and all of them like coming to the Christmas party and, being partners in the cabin and going on float trips with them and sitting around the campfire and always thinking them as a person first and a party second.
Which is the funny part, I think. I was thinking about that the other day when there was some big debate about it all. And I thought, I'm not even sure I really knew which party. I mean, maybe I knew who they voted for. And so I thought about that. But it was not so defined, like, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat. And it certainly wasn't a characteristic that moved to the top of the list. It was like so far down,
Yeah. And now I feel like it's just all the time. And I think that probably affected how I approached these issues in the book. Like, I mentioned every single one because I think if you wrote a book about Alaska, you didn't talk about how now, there's a fall, and there was never really a fall growing up when I was a kid. We didn't have the seasons the way you guys did. We had something we didn't have a spring either. We had the breakup. The lakes would break up, the ice would go out to sea, and then it was summer. There was no spring. And in the fall, it would be like, seriously, I think like April 15th was the opening of like what you would call like, caribou season or something. And then that would be pretty much fall. By the end of August, like there'd be like 2 days where the leaves would turn yellow, what leaves we had, and they'd fall down on the ground. Now there's like a real beautiful fall, which by the way is incredible and a great time to go to Alaska. And the mosses turn these colors and there's beautiful red leaves, but that's a real effect of climate change. That's a real thing. You can't, and also, the fact that in the summertime, it often gets to be 90 degrees and people are getting air conditioners in Alaska.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to bring all those details in and look at climate change in little tiny ways in each story, right? Without making a story called climate change. You know what I mean?
And feeling like you're preaching at the reader, which I think most readers really appreciate. It's much better to just have it wound into the story. And then
Yeah.
you stay thinking about that issue, but you're not feeling like, well, she is really trying to convince me about this, banging me over the head with it, you know?
No, I'm not, 'cause I'm not sure what and I'm not sure what any solution is or anything, but I do know that if I insert in one story and then maybe insert it in skip a story and then insert it into a second story later on, you'll go, "Ding, ah." I heard about spring in the first story, and now I've heard about fall in the third story, and then, now I'm gonna maybe hear about the smog problem in Anchorage and how it's trapping wood stove heat, in the fifth story, and it'll sort of make a little pattern of, like, what it's like to live there now, which is something that contemporary, these stories are set from 1915 all the way up to the present day. And they kind of do talk about, how we treat the environment throughout them, from 1915 when they cut down all the forests and burned them to build Anchorage and, until now where we now have spring and fall, right? But I think it's just supposed to reflect the contemporary ideas that we have now and the contemporary reality, which is what makes, reading new work so exciting. Like I remember reading There by Tommy Orange and his idea or his whole notion of like what he was talking about was like the urban Indian, and what that whole culture was, when you're Native American living in a city. And it opened that world to me that is very much our present day that I would have not gotten a glimpse of. And that's sort of what I wanted to do with my book is like show a glimpse of a world that other people wouldn't maybe know or be as familiar with.
And I always love those type of books. I think that's what I gravitate toward is learning about an area or a group of people or a culture or something that I have not been familiar with before.
Well, thank you. Me too. Honestly, I tried to write a book that I wanted to read. You know what I mean? I was really thinking about storytelling, instead of things like plot or, like storytelling to me, I don't really understand what plot is and I'll never be able to write that way. But I wanted there to be like stakes, like you were going to be worried as you're reading the story. Like, are they going to make it across this lake with these two children cross country skiing and it's like 7 degrees out? They don't all have to be so dramatic. Another way to say is like, is she going to leave her husband or not? But I felt like I wanted there to be like emotional pressure on the story where you wanted to turn pages because it was a story. You know what I mean? It wasn't a thought experiment, or it wasn't like I was trying to make a statement about art, or I wanted there to be old fashioned story in it, and I wanted there to be old fashioned place, even if the subject matter and characters all felt pretty modern.
Or like in Hijinks, where you're like, I hope he's going to be there to pick them up at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And they're kind of running out of food on that raft trip.
They're eating lots and lots of salmon.
Yeah, these two girls go on a raft trip with their dads, and it, a number of factors go wrong. They don't bring enough food. It starts to rain. The raft is going very, very slowly, and there's a lot of funniness to it because the girls are like pulling over and making talent shows at night about like Rod Stewart songs and stuff. So you're laughing, but there's always a little bit of unease. Like, are they gonna? I mean, honestly, I guess it's the title, right? Are they gonna make it out of that trip alive?
Well, how about coming up for the title for this one? I know it's one of the short stories, but how did you decide which story to pick as the title story? And then tell me about the cover.
Okay, great. Oh, these were two of the greatest, experiences of my life, my writing life. So what happened was I had written a memoir called Still Points North that came out. And when I was done with it, I was struggling and trying to write a novel because that's what you're supposed to do. And I just couldn't find one I could commit to. And then I was sort of thinking back about my past and I was like, gosh, I wrote all those short stories like 10 years ago before I started write nonfiction. And I never really wrote one where I knew I had landed it. You know what I mean? Like I knew that wasn't panicking the whole time I was writing it. And I sat down and said, I'm going to try and write a short story. Let's just try and write a great short story. Let's read a bunch of stories and let's see, like, let's take the New Yorker and read that and see if you could write one with that kind of thickness. I don't know what I mean by thickness, but I mean like heft, a novel, a short story that feels like a novel, but it's perfectly organized and you want to tear through the pages and then the end feels so satisfying. And I wrote this story about this mastodon, this man that has a mastodon in his living room. And there's a couple that have this wedding party in this living room in Anchorage. And their wedding goes completely off the rails. The bride is flirting with the host. The groom is miserable. And it's, kind of dark and hilarious, but it's also like a statement about marriage and how much we know the people we marry, essentially.
Or don't know them.
Yeah, or don't know them, exactly. And at the end of the story, I was like, oh, I think I did it. I mean, it wasn't perfectly there, but I was like, I think this might be like an organized story. And And I showed it to a friend. She's like, it is an organized story. Make a couple changes and write another one. At the end of Nobody Gets Out Alive, I realized there were other people in that party that I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about Janice, who was one of the women who was knitting. And I ended up writing this long story about where she had been going with her mother and her brother who has special needs. And then I also wrote a story about the wife, the newlywed wife, as a young woman. That's hijinks down the raft. And then I end up picking up different people and putting in dinner parties throughout, which was kind of fun. But I got the phrase "nobody gets out alive" from what the father of what someone said. I mean, there's a man who, it does not appear in the story, but he had killed himself, and his son is still upset about it even now at age 50. And he talks about the suicide note, which was "nobody gets out alive." And that was a phrase, a family phrase, was one of those places where, my personal life entered the fictional story. I'd always thought about that phrase and what it meant. And it kind of slid in the perfect way when you're talking about suicide and depression and facing down your demons. And I put it as the title of the story. And then as I added and added and added stories, I thought about changing the title story to something else a few times, like Howl Palace. But I don't know. I just felt like first impulse, best impulse. I'm doing it.
I love it because I think when you are talking about Alaska too, and that kind of wild, remote area, then Nobody Gets Out Alive sort of ties in with that a little bit.
And a lot of it too had to do with me, like, what we do with our lives and the choices we make, because there's a sense of urgency in all these stories about how people are handling their lives and whether they're going to improve their circumstances or not.
Absolutely. And will.
That's why I love the cover, because the cover, I think there should be one or two other covers that were just beautiful covers. I mean, I remember being knocked out. I was like, this is the prettiest cover I have ever seen. And then I said to the lady, it has nothing to do with who I am or what these stories are. I am just not pretty.
You're like, this is beautiful, but it does not tie into my book,
I know.
Which is a huge pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, but I felt bad because I was like, these covers are like almost like the covers I'd like of the person I'd like to be. Like, I'd love to be that pretty and tasteful. But I'm not. Like, I'm so over the top and I'm outspoken and I'm always shooting from the hip. And sometimes people like it and sometimes they don't. And that's something I have to live with. But very much my characters are like that too. I don't think, that anybody in my book they're lovely people, but they're deeply flawed and they have big mouths. And I felt like they brought this cover back to me with all of the boot print, right? And then you look at it once and you think, oh, that's a boot print. And then you look at it again, and you see, oh, there's a wolf inside the boot print. And there's a woman with the pack, and there's a woman walking into the woods, and there are these trees, and here's a bear print. I literally wanted to sob with joy. I'm not kidding. This designer, and her name is, I'm going to credit her because Lauren Peters Collier, captured everything and more about my book without me saying a single word to explain it. She just came out of that of her own imagination. And then to have it be in this rich red color, I felt so much. I know this sounds exaggerated or even like a little weird, but I went all the way with this book personally. And it felt sometimes like I was writing it in my own blood. I was exposing so much. Though it was fiction, it felt like I was exposing so much about myself, about my past, about anything I'd ever experienced. So having it be in that red color just to me felt like it showed everything about what the book was personality wise and the stakes. Having it be red just felt like blood, like all the way. Notice, emotionally for me, it felt, anyway, I was thrilled. The people at Scribner were so good to me. I can't thank them enough.
Well, I think it's stunning, and I think it is very representative of your book, even before I learned about the blood. And now I know it really is.
Oh, thank you.
But I think it's important. Covers are so much more important than people realize. And I think that's something I talk regularly about. I've had a cover designer on. I'm going to have another one on. But I think the importance of first having the cover match the story, which you talked about at first, like it just drives me crazy to find a cover I love and then I read the book and I'm like, well, I love the cover and I love the book, but there is no connection. But I think it's also wonderful when you have this stunning cover and I know exactly from looking at it, at least the general idea of what your book is going to be about.
Thanks. I feel that too. I was really, it's the thing is like covers are a little bit like titles in the sense that, you don't want the cover or the title to narrate what is going to happen, right?
Right.
Or nor do you want it to like spell it out. Like you would never want a title like a book of stories about Alaska, about a book of stories about Alaskan women. You know what I mean? Same thing with a cover. You don't want it to be like, here's a picture of an Alaskan woman and she's got an axe. I mean, I know people do stories like that, some covers like that, but I think what you want with a cover and with a title is it for it to like illustrate a feeling, knock at a feeling, or provoke a feeling in you that somehow goes with what the feeling of the book is.
I think that's the perfect way to describe it, to provoke a feeling in you for what you're going to be experiencing.
Right. That's exactly right. That's why titles are so hard and covers are so hard, you know?
No, I agree. But it is one of those things that there is so much personality and uniqueness involved in it,
Yeah.
and feelings. Like when you see something, sometimes people will say, well, you love that cover, but why? And sometimes it's hard to say exactly why. It's just the way it makes you feel.
It's like also, you know who's really good at this? It's the people that make the opening for TV shows sometimes.
Like the kind of scenes as it's opening.
You know, the credits, like there was this show called Blood Ties, and it had a lot of things that I would love about a story or a novel, and that it was set in Key West. And for some reason, they have a lot more tools at their disposal, right? Like they can use music, but it had these kind of Led Zeppelin-y kind of 70s music that they apparently invented. And then it had all these kind of, evocative things of the ocean going in and out with racing clouds that led to the feeling of all this chaos that was going to happen in this family without a single picture of a human being, no pictures of the family gathered together, at their little hotel. It was all mood and tone, which I think is part of this whole process.
That's an interesting point. We've been watching Stranger Things. I had never watched it before. And with my daughter coming home from college, she wanted to watch it. So she and my husband and I have been binge watching to get caught up. And they do a wonderful job in their intros.
Yeah, they do. My son is actually binge watching the new season. He's got COVID and he's in there binge watching it right now, no doubt. But it's crazy about how many little different tiny things have to fit together. You've got to find that title. You've got to get that cover. You've got to get the right editor to, help you get the stories in the right shape. Within each story, you've got to have, so many components. It's crazy the books get written.
It really is. And the interview that I recently did, I do this behind the scenes series that's once a month, and it's people in the publishing industry. And so the one I just did was the interior designer of a book. And I have had so much great feedback about that because a lot of people don't know how much goes into, the font and the leading and the margins and the cover page and extra pages and multiples of 16. Like it's just been so fascinating. And it was really interesting and it's resonated with a lot of people. And I think you just don't realize sometimes how much it takes to get a book out in the world.
I know. I don't think I realized it either. Honestly, I've edited a lot of other books. Like I'm an editor at Zibby Books with Zibby Owens, and I'm much more involved in that process than I have been in other parts of my life. Like I used to be an editor at Catapult, and I would do my editing, but I didn't really track as much the interior design. I was always involved in the covers, and we had a wonderful cover designer there named Nicole Caputo. But now I'm sort of getting into every little nitty gritty. I mean, even things as small as how people do acknowledgments.
Right.
I really thought about the acknowledgments in my book, and I don't know what happened. It was supposed to be just one page. I didn't want to have 17 pages of specific acknowledgement. I did that for my first book. I felt like there were far fewer people involved in this book. So much of it I wrote privately, and I wanted to just have their name sort of simply put in as just a few things because I wanted to be super personal. I didn't know whether I wanted to share how every single person helped me, but I wanted to say I wanted to say thank you to them, but I felt like my relationship with them in the book was personal. I wasn't sure I wanted to say, oh, dear Fiona, thank you for reading all those drafts. It was a really private process in a way. And that's a different kind of thanks.
Definitely. No, and that makes sense. But it is just so interesting to know, as I've kind of learning more and more about the whole process, all these different things that have to be decided and chosen and selected.
Oh my God, everything. Even just the copying, they're like, do you want to italicize this? I used a lot of hyphens. So we had a lot of talks about hyphens. I'm one of those writers with an Emily Dickinson M- issue. I never saw an M- I didn't like.
You're like, that's fine. I put it here on purpose. Just leave it alone.
It does everything a comma does and even better.
Exactly. Well, and editor-in-chief of Zibby Books, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. How has that been? That's very exciting.
Are you kidding? It's been a joy. Zibby is a wonderful podcaster and
she is
a huge literary champion for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of writers. And she decided to start an imprint for, making kind of book club accessible, wonderful, female centric, but not, absolutely men are invited too, titles. And so she asked me to be her editor in chief, and we started this company in September. And we are headed for our first book to come out in January 2023. Right? It's 2022 now. I've lost all sense of time in January. And it's so fun. She's so collaborative. We have a team. It is not a company. I've never been in this kind of open exchange of ideas before, and everyone is participating. It's super inspiring, honestly. Like I get really excited to wake up in the morning, write a little bit of my new book because I have a novel under contract, and then like go work on these other people's amazing books with really smart, motivated, and hardworking staff members.
It seems like a great group, and it's been really fun to see the books that you guys have been acquiring. I can't wait till they actually come out into the world. So on the note of great books, what have you read recently that you really liked?
Well, I did read Our Country Friends by Gary Shteyngart, and I really enjoyed that. I love his use of language, cross-cultural references between, a Russian and an Indian American and a Korean American. And he writes this and that he was able to incorporate the pandemic because all of these people from New York end up in the country living in a bungalow community. And I wouldn't normally say that would interest me in any way. Just coming up as an Alaskan, I'd be like, I'm not really interested about city people that don't know how to deal in the country. But boy, I would have been so wrong because the book is so joyous and it's so funny and it's so smart. And then at the end is pretty sad in a good way. But I'm reading I picked up The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead again, and I'm really enjoying that. I'd sort of punked out on that.
Great Circle has been probably one of the highest recommended books on my podcast. When I ask people that at the end, it gets mentioned over and over again. I have it in both hardback and paperback, but I have not read it yet. But it is definitely on my list. It's just so big. And so every time I think, I'll sit down to read it, then I realize, I've got all these others I need to read for the podcast or for something else. And so someday when I have a window of time large enough to read it, I'm going to sit down and pick it up.
I will say, I'm a huge fan of her writing. I loved her book, Seating Arrangements, and I really loved the one about the dancing. I think it's called Astonish Me. But this book, I tell you, I picked it up and I did put it down because it's got a past component and a present component. And I think in my life, I was really speeding around. So it wasn't just that it was long. It was different narrators and different time. And it's a slow burn, right? It's one of those books like Pachinko where, the pages accrue and you become deeply and deeply and deeply and more deeply involved. But it's not like you're going to sit down and read those first 40 pages and go, oh my God, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it takes patience, and I think it's worth the patience. And I think she certainly knew what she was doing. She was kind of writing an epic. But when I first sat down to read it, I don't think I would think I was so, frenetic and frantic with my own life. I didn't give it the attention it deserved. So I actually went and bought another copy because I put it down and lost it. And when I was on book tour this week in Alaska, I picked up another copy. There's this front narrative about a girl in Hollywood and then a back narrative about this woman who I think becomes a pilot. I'm not far enough in, but it's intriguing.
What I found, because it is so large, that it was kind of hard to read as a hardback because it was just so darn heavy. So that's why I was like, okay, I'm going to get the paperback and that will be a lot easier. But, I've just begun Fellowship Point by Alice Elliott Dark.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. Oh, I'm so excited. Sorry.
It is so good, but it's the same way. It is definitely not a page turner in terms of a thriller. There's a lot of build up and character development, and it's very, very good, but it's not one of those that you're like, I just have to keep turning the pages. I know that as, everything keeps developing, it's getting better and better, but it's definitely also, I think, a little bit of a slow burn, but I'm really enjoying it, but it's not a, page turning story or whatever.
But you know what? Her book, I actually was just with her she was a panel. I was on a panel at a book festival at the Montclair, New Jersey Book Festival. And I almost actually fainted with fandom because her book, the story, she has these two books of short stories. One's called The Gloaming, and her short stories are so incredible. She hasn't published, I think, any story collections for 20 years. She's been writing this beautiful novel that I am dying to read that you're just mentioning. But if anybody's out there listening and they feel like a big novel is too much to tackle, go back and read her short stories because she is a master. I mean, when we're talking about how do you evoke feeling, she has this kind of haunted sadness that is just, it is so rich. It's not, morbid or melancholy for melancholy's sake. It is pregnant with life experience. I love her work. And I'm trying to get the galley for that novel. We have the same publisher, and I called them, and I'm waiting by the door for the package to come.
That's right, because I was looking at your publisher just to verify it again this morning when I was, reviewing your book, and I was like, oh, how interesting. They are both Scribner.
Yeah. Everybody who I've read that book that has read it has used the same word in its masterpiece.
Yeah, I agree. You're slowly getting to know the characters, and that takes a little while. But no, I'm definitely enjoying it. It is a beautiful story, but I think it's one of those that over time, it's building on itself.
I can't even tell you. I loved A Little Life. And I remember reading the first 100 pages and being like, I don't know, 4 guys in New York. Do I care? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, they're all rich. They're all doing fine. One's a famous painter. One's a famous this. I don't know if I really care. And I don't know. I wasn't that into it. Then all of a sudden on page 100, my God, the scales fell off your eyes. And then I just had to stay up for days finishing the next 400 pages. You know what I mean? And it became one of those great books for my whole life. That's the whole great part about reading is like, your individual understanding of each book. And like, sometimes that slow burn can like be a whole delight in and of itself, considering like how fast television moves. Like you'll have a person live, die, and go to heaven all in one episode.
It's too quick. No, I agree. And I do think those longer stories, they also, I mean, of course they're going to take longer to develop because they're so much longer. You can't, everything can't happen super fast. You've got 500 and something pages. So, but it's delightful.
But you do have to decide, I'm ready for this at this point in my life. You know what I mean? And that happens to me a lot. Like with some of my favorite books, I'll just be like, there's something wrong with me. All my friends love this book and I read 20 pages and I just couldn't get into it. And then I realized what's wrong is not the book. It's actually me. I'm not in the mood to read this kind of story right now. I should put them at a holy shelf and just come back in 2 years. That happened with Henry James. I just dismissed Henry James for like 5 years. And I even took a class on him in college and like just barely skimmed it and wrote the papers. And then, in my 20s, I went through something and I remember reading A Portrait of a Lady, and it just resonated with me so deeply about what happens when you marry the wrong person for the wrong reasons, and like how you're trying to be an artist, but in name only, not in your spirit. And I don't know. And then I became the world's greatest Henry James fan. I read every single thing he wrote.
I do think that's exactly right. I think one, I'm a huge mood reader, so it really does depend on what I'm in the mood for and what I've just read. If I've just read this book that I absolutely loved, sometimes I need to read something lighter, like a palate cleanser to kind of clear it up and be ready for the next great book. But also, I think some of it is life experiences, what you're going through right then or what you've experienced in the past. And sometimes those things just don't resonate with you if you haven't necessarily dealt with something like that.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, and that's also, I was thinking about too, like during the pandemic, I just bombed out. I mean, I read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, and I regret, I just slogged through that. I don't even know what happened. I had trouble reading each sentence. I feel embarrassed now.
It's not her best either, though.
It's not her best.
I mean, I love Jane Austen, but it is not her best. So, I mean, I can understand that. It'd be different if you said that about Persuasion or Pride and Prejudice. I'd be like, Leigh. But about Mansfield Park, I can understand.
Thank you, because it is kind of embarrassing. Nobody wants to knock the Austen. You know what I mean?
Nah, that's okay. Well, this has been absolutely delightful, Leigh. I'm so glad you joined me today on the Thoughts from a Page podcast. Thank you.
No, I'm so happy to be invited, Cindy. This was really, you're such a thoughtful reader, and the conversation is kind of exciting because my day is not littered with people that read as much as you do or as thoughtfully. And so it's actually been a privilege.
Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Joe.
And we're the Professional Book Nerds. 2 Mondays a month, we interview authors and talk about their upcoming books, what drives them, and their go-to order at the cafe.
On Thursdays, we share recommendations and dive into topics readers face, like how do I actually read the books on my to-be-read list?
You can find the Professional Book Nerds podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Want to learn more about us? Our website is professionalbooknerds.com, and you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at ProBookNerds.
We hope you'll come and listen, and as always,
happy reading!
Thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my podcast. I want to quickly share about this wonderful company I am now partnering with. I am always looking for entities that promote and highlight books, and recently came across Book Clubs, a company who provides all sorts of resources for established and new book clubs, as well as individual readers. My own personal book club recently signed up on Book Clubs, and the group has been impressed with all of the great tools the site and app provide. The Book Club's website is linked in my show notes, and I hope you will check them out soon. Also, if you like my show, I would be so grateful if you would tell everyone you know about it and rate it on whichever platform you listen on. It truly makes a huge difference and really helps the show grow. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and that link is also in the show notes. I hope you will check out some other Thoughts from a Page episodes and have a great day.
Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Joe.
And
we're the Professional Book Nerds.
2 Mondays a month, we interview authors and talk about their upcoming books, what drives them, and their go-to order at the cafe.
On Thursdays, we share recommendations and dive into topics readers face, like how do I actually read the books on my to-be-read list?
You can find the Professional Book Nerds podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Want to learn more about us? Our website is professionalbooknerds.com, and you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at ProBookNerds.
We hope you'll come and listen, and as always,
happy reading.